I'm Carl Franklin. On this episode of Blazor Train, I'll show you how you can develop a Blazor WASM app and a Blazor Server app at the same time from a single code base, and why you'd want to do that in the first place. And that's coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train. Blazor Train! So far, we've learned that Blazor Server apps run on a server and Blazor WebAssembly apps run in the browser. We've learned how Blazor Server works, using SignalR to bridge the gap between the browser and the server. And we've learned how WebAssembly works and how Blazor apps run on top of WebAssembly using a small cross-platform .NET runtime. We've covered the pros and cons of each hosting model. And by now, you should have a good idea of which one you want to use. But you might not be sure. Maybe you won't know until you actually see your app running in both environments. Maybe you'd like to develop your app twice, once with Blazor Server and once with Blazor WebAssembly, and then you can compare the two. But wouldn't it be great if you could just run the same app in the different environments? Turns out you can do that. You can develop a Blazor Server and a Blazor WASM app at the same time in a single Visual Studio solution, utilizing the Blazor WASM's code base, but running it on the server and running both versions in separate browsers so you can test your code running in both environments. Even if you don't want to develop your application like this, it's a really good exercise to drive home the difference between the server and WebAssembly hosting models. Here's a summary of what you need to do. First, create a new Blazor Server project. Next, add a new WebAssembly project to the solution, selecting the option for being ASP.NET Core hosted. Then add a project reference from the Blazor Server app to the Blazor WASM app, and also to the shared project. Next, you change the reference to the app class in hosts CS.html in your server app to point to the client app's app class. You'll see, it's easy. Finally, open the solution properties and select multiple startup projects, the Blazor Server app and the Blazor WASM Server app. Now when you press F5, both apps will run in separate browsers. Well, let's jump over to Visual Studio and we can walk through this together. Okay, so we got Visual Studio 2019 up here. We're going to create a new Blazor app, and I'm going to call it Dual Blazor because we're showing how to develop server and client hosting models at the same time. It's going to be a Blazor Server app. Okay, and the very first thing I'm going to do is right-click on the solution and add a new project. Also a Blazor app. This time we're calling it Dual Blazor WASM, and it will be a Blazor WebAssembly app. Now I'm also going to select ASP.NET Core hosted because I want a server to host it, and I also want that third project that has the models in it. Okay, now before we do anything else, go ahead and build the solution. Okay, so how do we tell Visual Studio that we want to run the code from the client app on the server? Well, first thing we need to do is add a reference, a project reference, from the Blazor Server app to the Blazor client app. So I'm right-clicking, Add Project Reference in the Blazor Server app, and I want these two projects. Dual Blazor WASM Client, that has the code in it, so I definitely need that. And also the shared project, which has the model, Weather Forecast. So that's what I want. I do not want, need, or can't use this reference here to Dual Blazor WASM Server. We're not going to do that. We only want access to the code. Let's go ahead and build it again. Okay. Now the second step is to actually create the reference in the Blazor application itself. Project reference is fine, but now we have to add a reference to the code itself. And that is done here in the underscore host CS HTML page of the Blazor server application. Now let's just take a look at this HTML file here. It's a CS HTML file, but this is essentially the one page in your Blazor server application. This is where everything starts, right? The HTML tag. So we've got our links and our header and our meta and all that stuff, but down in the body, this part right here is just for error UI. And this part right here is just the Blazor script. So the whole of your UI resides in this app component and indeed in this app class. That is all of your pages, your components, your code behind everything in your UI code is represented in that app. So rather than use our app, I'm going to use dual Blazor WASM client app. Right? So this is what is going to instantiate your code, and it's going to run it on the server, but it's the code for the client. Does that follow? Okay. The other thing I need to do is turn off pre-rendering, and I can do that by setting render mode to server. Now, I don't necessarily have to do this, but I want to. We'll talk about pre-rendering a little bit later, but the reason I want to do this is pre-rendering is a server-side feature. It doesn't exist in Blazor WASM. Okay? So I want the behavior of the code to be exactly the same. So I just want to set that to not pre-rendered. Next, we're going to, you guessed it, build again. And now we're going to go to the solution properties to tell Visual Studio that I want to run both of these projects at the same time. I want to run the Blazor server app, and I want to run the Blazor WASM app via its server. So multiple startup projects. I want to start dual Blazor. Oh, it looks like I got an extra L capital there. Oh well. And dual Blazor WASM server, right? I want to start both of those projects when I press F5, which I'm going to do right now. And let's see what happens. Okay. All right, so here we are. We're running both of these at the same time. And this is the Blazor server app. This is the Blazor client on the left. And how do I know? Because they look the same. Well, if we take a look up at the very top, this says dual Blazor. That's our server app. And at the very top in the tab over here, it says dual Blazor WASM. That's how you can tell. Now, just to be absolutely clear on this, I could actually delete these pages right out of our Blazor server application and it would still run. That's because we're actually running these pages right here on the server. But just to test it, let's go to index and say server side. And if index comes up with server side, we know that something is wrong. But I know it's not going to. Nope, it says, hello world, welcome to your new app. All right, so on the client side, we have our counter, we have our fetch data, everything works just fine. On the server side, the counter works fine, but what about this? We have a problem here. Let's find out what it is. We'll press F12, and you can see the error is that there is no registered service of type system net HTTP client. So this is to be expected. Let's find out why. First of all, let's look at fetch data on the server side, the one that we would normally be calling. We're injecting this weather forecast service, which is in dual Blazor data, weather forecast service. All right, we're injecting it, and we have an instance called forecast service. And then we just call get forecast async. All right, so let's take a look at that. What is that? Well, in the data folder, here's the model, weather forecast, and here's our service. So let's look at weather forecast first. It's a very simple model. So a date, temperature, and summary. And this service just simply uses some randomization to create temperatures and gives a summary, which is just a random version of, you know, what the weather is like outside, and just returns it. So it's all on the server. Now remember, I told you that with Blazor Server, one of the benefits is that we don't have to have an API layer to go get data. We're already on the server, we can just go get some data. So think of this as maybe it would be from, you know, a SQL server, or maybe calling into a database that's in the cloud, or whatever. That doesn't matter. The whole idea is that with Blazor Server, you can directly access resources that require credentials. But it's not that way with Blazor Client. So let's look at fetch data in the Blazor WASM. So this guy is using dual Blazor WASM shared because that's where the model is. And we have this HTTP client, and this is what the Blazor Server app was complaining it didn't have access to. Because we're using that HTTP client to call this URI right there, which is a relative URI, weather forecast, and we're just making an API call. So let's look on the Blazor WASM server in the controllers folder. There's our weather forecast controller. Okay. There it is. And our weather forecast controller is an API controller. It's doing the same thing, except this is in the context of Web API. So there's the difference, and there's why fetch data had a problem on the server side, because it doesn't know what HTTP client is, because that service isn't available to it. So you might be saying, yes, but it's the same code, we're just running it in different environments. Well, that's the key, different environments. On the server environment, we don't have access to it. And the startup CS file is where we can configure those services that are going to run in that environment on the server. So we need to say services, add singleton or add scoped, system, net, HTTP, HTTP client, and now we can inject that thing, no problem. I had to do that because the code was expecting HTTP client to be available for injection, and it wasn't. All right, so that'll get us to step 2. We won't get that error anymore, but I think we're going to still get an error. Do you know what it might be? Let's find out. Yep, we are getting an error. Here's what it is. The URI that was provided is invalid. An invalid request URI was provided. It must be an absolute URI, or the base address must be set. In other words, the Blazor Server app doesn't know what this is, because it's not relative to Blazor Server. There is no API controller on Blazor Server in the application there. We could add one, but there isn't one. But we want to make sure that we're only calling one controller, right? Not have two different controllers. So I need to make this an absolute URI, or set the base address. So let's find out what the URI is. Well, it's going to be localhost some port. Let's go to the Blazor WASM, dual Blazor WASM server under properties launch settings.json, and we can see the SSL port here is 44322. So really all I have to do is change this to HTTPS localhost 44322 weather forecast. And now everybody should be happy. So fetch data on the client side works with an absolute URL just as it would with a relative URL, but also, more importantly, fetch data on the server side, we'll be able to call into that API. Now there's one more thing I want to talk about before I let you go with this demo, and that is JavaScript. So back up a little bit. We saw that the environment had to have the same resources available to it on the server as on the client. We had to add the HTTP client so it could be injectable on the server to make the code work. If you are doing JavaScript interop and you're calling a method, foo, whatever, a method, I don't care what it's called, you have to have those same JavaScript functions available in both environments. JavaScript is not part of the code base that's in that app object. Okay, it lives in the browser, right? On the client, it's going to live in the browser on the client, and on the server, it's going to live in the browser from the server. It has to be in that same place. So I'm going to talk about JavaScript interop in a later edition of Blazor Train, but suffice to say for now, that's part of the environment. All right, well, that's all I got for the demo. Thanks a lot for watching. So now you know how to build a Blazor server and a Blazor WebAssembly app at the same time. On the next episode of Blazor Train, I'll talk to Steve Sanderson and David Fowler from Microsoft for the story about how Blazor came into being. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blazor Train!